The gunshot was a punctuation mark at the end of the day. It cracked across the Montana prairie, and the sky spat a flock of black birds into the bruised sunset. Clara stumbled, one hand clamped to her thigh, warmth leaking through the tear in her riding skirt. The world was swimming. 3 days of running had turned her breath to sand and her will to a flickering candle flame. The West of 1878 didn't pity the tired. It just kept stretching mile after merciless mile until you gave up and let it swallow you whole. Hoofbeats rose from the hush. They weren't frantic. They weren't the hurried thunder of a posse. They were slow, steady, unafraid, the sound of a predator that knows its prey is already wounded. Clara tried to melt into the shadow of a lone cottonwood, but the fire in her leg screamed no. A tall rider slid from a chestnut horse like water poured from a canteen. His hat brim was low, his shoulders broad enough to block out the dying light. A badge on his coat caught the last rays of the sun, a tiny star in the growing dark. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for the easy heroics men use when they want to be seen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice was even as bedrock, "you're bleeding something fierce." "Stay back," Clara breathed, her own voice a dry rasp. I have a gun." "And I have water," he answered, his hands held open, palms out. He kept his distance. "Bandages, too. Name's Thomas." The name landed plain and calm. A stone dropped into a still pond. He crouched a dozen feet away, his eyes mapping the ground. He saw the blood, the way she braced against the tree bark, as if the wood itself could hold her together. He saw the terror in her eyes, and something else beneath it. Something hard. "They'll come looking," she whispered, the words meant for herself. "Men who think deeds and dollars make them gods." "Then we don't wait on gods," Thomas said. "We move." His coat was off in one practiced sweep, a shield of wool he wrapped around her shoulders like a promise. He nodded toward the horizon where night was pulling the shadows, long and deep, across the gullies. "It'll hurt," he warned. "It already does," she said. His vision swam, her hand trembling as she tried to keep the stranger at bay. The man's shadow stretched across the prairie dust, steady, unthreatening. His badge glinted faintly, a small piece of order in a world of chaos, but his tone carried no command, only a quiet, unnerving persuasion. "I don't know you," Clara whispered, her voice weak but edged with the last of her defiance. "For all I know, you could finish what those men started." Thomas crouched slowly, keeping his distance. "I could," he admitted with a blunt honesty that shocked her more than any denial would have. "But I won't. What I do have are bandages, clean water, and a hand steady enough to see you through this." He paused, and his eyes, storm gray and watchful, met hers without flinching. "If you'll allow me." Years of hardship had carved lines into his face, maps of sorrows she couldn't begin to read. Yet something in his gaze told her he wasn't there to take advantage. He was there to stand guard. She pressed her palm harder against her wound, choking back a groan as another wave of pain crashed over her. "It hurts too much to move." "That's why I'm here," Thomas said softly. The words slipped past her defenses, as though he had spoken them 100 times before, a strange and familiar prayer. As though he had spoken directly to the ache in her bones and the fear buried deep beneath it. He reached forward gently, his movements slow and deliberate, moving her bloodied hand aside to reveal the ragged tear in her flesh. His touch was cautious, almost reverent, as if to say, "You are safe, at least for this moment." With practiced efficiency, he tore a strip of clean cloth from his saddlebag, binding her thigh tight enough to stall the bleeding. He rinsed the wound with water from his canteen, every motion precise. Clara winced, biting her lip until she tasted iron. Yet his calm voice anchored her in the storm of her own pain. "It's bad, but not hopeless," he said, his eyes on his work. "The bullet's still in there. I'll need to get you to my cabin. It's an hour's ride from here. Can you trust me that far?" Her mind screamed, "No." Trust was a currency she no longer had, but her body, starved and broken, sagged into surrender. The empty prairie offered no other choice. Thomas didn't wait for a verbal answer. He lifted her into his arms with a surprising gentleness, her head resting against the solid thud of his heartbeat. The steady rhythm, the smell of leather and pine, and the low rumble of his voice as he spoke to his horse stitched a fragile thread of trust in the darkness. As the horizon swallowed the last ember of sunlight, Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 days, she wasn't running alone, but she had no idea what she was running towards. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. A single lantern threw a steady golden light across rough-hewn walls. Thomas moved with that same practiced calm, setting out what little he had on a small wooden table: a bottle of whiskey, boiled cloths, a knife heated in the lamp's flame until it glowed a dull orange, and a long, thin pair of tweezers. His voice stayed low, reassuring, even as Clara's eyes widened at the sight of the crude surgical tools. "I won't lie to you," he said, meeting her gaze. "This will hurt worse than anything you've known. But if I don't take that bullet out now, infection will finish what the outlaw started." Clara swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. He pressed the whiskey bottle into her hands. She took a burning gulp, then another, until the fire in her chest nearly matched the fire in her leg. Then she pushed the bottle aside, her jaw set. With a quiet steadiness, Thomas placed a folded leather belt between her teeth. "Bite down," he instructed. "Don't hold back. There's no one for miles to hear you scream." The first touch of hot metal to her wound sent a bolt of pure agony through her body. A scream tore from her throat, muffled by the leather. She writhed against the quilt, hot tears spilling down her temples and into her hair. But Thomas's hands never wavered. He worked with the grim precision of someone who had done this too many times before. She could see the scars on his own arms, pale lines that bore silent witness to past wars and old pains. His voice became her only lifeline in the sea of agony. Soft words, murmured encouragements, reminders to breathe. "Just a little longer. Stay with me, Clara." At last, the sickening scrape of metal against bone gave way, and the bullet came free with a slick, pulling sensation. He dropped the flattened piece of lead into a tin bowl with a sharp clink. Clara nearly lost consciousness, the cabin spinning around her, but the pressure of his hand on hers kept her tethered to the waking world. "You're doing fine," he whispered, already stitching the torn flesh with steady, even fingers. "The worst is over." When dawn bled pale light through the single window, she lay exhausted but alive, her thigh bound tight in clean cloth. For the first time in days, her body was no longer surrendering to death. It was fighting back. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke, the question raw. "Why? Why are you helping me? You don't know who I am. I could be running from the law for all you know." Thomas rinsed his hands in a basin of water, pausing before he answered. His expression was thoughtful, not suspicious. "Maybe. But are you?" "No," she whispered truthfully. "But the men chasing me? They're dangerous. You've made yourself a target by helping me." He shrugged, settling into a chair beside her bed. The wood creaked under his weight. "I've been a target before. The question isn't whether you're worth the trouble, it's whether you're worth saving." His eyes softened for just a moment. "And I already know the answer to that." Clara stared at him, the sharp edges of her fear slowly giving way to something else, something warm and fragile. Trust. She let her eyes drift around the small, sparse cabin. It was clean, orderly. A man's space, but not a careless one. A rifle rested on pegs over the door. A stack of worn books sat on a small shelf. Then her gaze fell on the stone mantelpiece above the cold hearth. Propped against the stone was a small, silver-backed hairbrush. It was intricately carved with vines and flowers, far too delicate for a place like this. It was an object of wealth, of a life far removed from this rugged cabin. Clara's blood ran cold. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, terrified drum. She had seen that brush before. She had seen it just days ago in the hands of the elderly woman on the Silver Creek stagecoach. The woman Blackwood had shot without a second thought, right before her husband's eyes. The man who had just saved her life, the man with kind eyes and steady hands, had a murdered woman's hairbrush sitting on his mantel. And suddenly the cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The crackle of the fire in the stove sounded like snapping bones. Clara lay propped against the quilt, her face pale but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. The silver hairbrush on the mantel seemed to gleam in the firelight, a silent accusation. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle that made no sense. Was he one of them? A scavenger who picked over the dead? Or something worse? She twisted the edge of the blanket in her hands, the rough wool a small, painful comfort. She had to know. She had to understand. "I was traveling on the Silver Creek stagecoach," she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound like a victim, and not like a woman laying a trap. There were 4 of them, led by a man they called Blackwood. He didn't hesitate. The driver, the guard. He shot them before they even had a chance to reach for their weapons. Thomas sat at the table, methodically oiling his rifle. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked up to meet hers, his attention absolute. Clara drew a shuddering breath, playing her part. There were 3 other passengers, an elderly couple, carrying a strongbox they said was for their son in Helena, and a young man, hardly more than a boy. Her voice faltered, breaking on the memory. It wasn't hard to fake the tears. Blackwood wanted the box. They killed them all, every last one. I was hiding under the seat, trying not to breathe. They didn't see me at first, but when they started searching the bodies, I panicked. I ran. One of them shot me as I reached the trees. Her hands trembled violently now, twisting the blanket so hard the stitches threatened to snap. I should have done something. Anything. Maybe distracted them. Maybe fought back. Instead, I just ran. Her gaze met Thomas's, desperate and full of a guilt that was all too real. And now they're all dead, and I'm still here. The rifle clicked shut beneath Thomas's steady hands. The sound was sharp and final in the small cabin. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along his cheek. "You'd be dead too if you had stayed," he said, his voice firm. "What you did was survive, and that survival is going to bring them to justice." Clara swallowed hard, the shame and the suspicion churning in her gut. "You don't understand." "I do," Thomas interrupted quietly. He set the rifle aside and leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed in the lamplight. 8 years ago, my wife and daughter boarded a stagecoach heading east. I was the sheriff in a town that didn't need one, too busy to ride with them. He paused, the words heavy with a grief that was still raw. The coach was robbed. I wasn't there to protect them. They were both killed before anyone even knew what had happened. For a moment, Clara forgot her own pain, her own fear. She stared at him as the pieces of his life fell into place. The hardness in his eyes, the shadows carved deep into his face. They weren't just from the prairie sun. They were born of an impossible loss. He looked toward the window where dawn was brushing pale gray across the horizon. "So yes, I understand what it means to carry a guilt that eats you alive, to lie awake at night wondering what you could have done differently. But I also know this: blaming yourself won't bring them back, and letting the men who did it keep breathing while good people lie in the ground, That's not justice. That's failure, and I won't let it happen again." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was filled with the raw weight of two people laying down the broken pieces of themselves, things neither had spoken aloud in years. Clara blinked against the tears threatening to fall, her chest tightening with something more than pain. It was recognition. Two lives, scarred in different ways by the same kind of brutal cruelty. But the hairbrush still sat on the mantel. The two stories didn't fit. He was a man hunting the killers of his family, but he possessed an item stolen from the victims of the very crime she'd escaped. The contradiction was a screaming alarm in her head. After a long moment, Thomas stood, moving to a shelf above the stove. He returned with a carved wooden checkerboard, its edges worn smooth by years of use. He set it down on the small table between them, his voice gentler now. "The wound will heal, but the nights are long when you're left alone with your thoughts. This helps." Clara stared at the board, startled by the sudden shift in his mood. "You want me to play a game?" "I want you to remember there's more to life than the things we've lost," he replied simply. "One move at a time, Clara. That's how you start again." She studied him, the man who had lifted her from the edge of death, who had revealed scars as deep as her own, and who kept a dead woman's finery like a trophy. She had to know the truth. Tentatively, she reached forward, her fingers brushing one of the wooden pieces. Her eyes, however, flicked to the mantel. "That's a beautiful brush," she said, her voice carefully casual. "A gift?" Thomas's gaze followed hers. For a fraction of a second, a shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something she couldn't read. Pain? Guilt? He looked back at the checkerboard, his expression unreadable. "It belonged to my wife," he said quietly, and the floor dropped out from under Clara's world. His wife. The wife who had died 8 years ago. But the brush was from the stagecoach, from 3 days ago. One of those things was a lie, and if he was lying about the brush, he could be lying about everything. The man playing checkers with her wasn't just a lawman, he was a liar. And she was trapped in his cabin, miles from anywhere, with a bullet wound in her leg and a terrible, impossible secret. The game of checkers felt like a battle of wills. Every move Clara made was calculated, not to win, but to buy time, to watch him. Every time Thomas countered, his face was a stoic mask, revealing nothing. He spoke of the weather, of the way the creek swelled in the spring, of anything but the lie that sat between them on the mantelpiece. His wife's brush. Clara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. What kind of man builds a shrine to his dead wife with stolen goods? The creak of the cabin door opening made them both freeze. Thomas's hand went instantly to the revolver at his hip, his body coiling like a snake ready to strike. Clara stiffened, her pulse leaping into her throat. For one terrifying heartbeat, she thought Blackwood's men had found them. But the tall figure who stepped into the lamplight was not one of them. His face was weathered and calm beneath the wide brim of a U.S. Marshal's hat. "Frank," Thomas breathed, lowering his weapon with a mixture of relief and exasperation. "You nearly got yourself shot." The man gave a dry smile, removing his hat to reveal hair more silver than gray. "Wouldn't be the first time," he replied. His sharp eyes flicked from Thomas to Clara, taking in her pale complexion and the bandages peeking from beneath her skirt. "This must be the young lady you mentioned in your message." Clara's brows knit together. "Message?" she asked, turning to Thomas. The lies were piling up. He shifted, looking uncomfortable for the first time. "The morning after I found you, I rode to Copper Creek and sent a telegram. Told Frank here what happened." The marshal, Frank, crossed the room with a soldier's efficient gait. "Good thing he did," he said, accepting a cup of coffee Thomas poured for him. "I've been tracking Blackwood's gang for months. They've hit stages all the way from Montana to Wyoming." He took a sip, his eyes never leaving Clara. "But they're down a man now." His gaze slid toward her, steady but not unkind. Found him dead 2 days ago, shot clean through the heart. Seems you're a better shot than you realize, miss. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She remembered the wild, desperate squeeze of the trigger as she fled the coach, the kick of the gun in her hand. She hadn't dared to hope the bullet had found its mark. I didn't mean to. You meant to survive, Frank said simply. And you did. But it's got Blackwood in a rage. He's not used to losing men, or quarry. That means he'll come for you. And he'll come harder. The words tightened the air in the room, every shadow seeming to press closer. Then we take the fight to him, Thomas said, his jaw set like granite. No more running. That's why I came, Frank agreed, nodding. I've got 3 deputies waiting for us in Whispering Pines. At first light, we ride out. We can cut him off at the old Miller place before he even thinks to come looking for this cabin. The resolve in the men's voices sparked something inside Clara, a fire that had been buried under layers of fear and grief and suspicion. She straightened in her chair, ignoring the dull ache in her healing leg. Then I'm coming with you. Both men turned on her at once. Absolutely not, Thomas said, his tone firm enough to crack stone. You're still healing. You can barely ride. And if a gunfight breaks out, Clara cut in, her voice ringing with a quiet determination that surprised them all. I'm the only one who can identify every single one of them. I saw their faces, all of them. She met Thomas's gaze, her own unwavering. Those people who died on that stagecoach deserve justice, and I intend to see it delivered. Frank leaned back in his chair, studying her with a newfound respect. He took another slow sip of his coffee. The lady makes a fair point, Thomas. Thomas's temper flared, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. She's been shot. She nearly died in my arms. And you want to throw her into the middle of another fight? Frank raised an eyebrow. Didn't seem to stop you last time I recall. You've taken more bullets than most men have had hot meals. That's different, Thomas snapped. Is it? Clara challenged softly. She stood, her leg protesting, and faced him. Her eyes were brimming with equal parts fear and courage. Is it different because I'm a woman? Or is it because you actually care what happens to me? The question carved straight through him. He raked a hand through his hair, frustration etched in every line of his face. Finally, his voice dropped, quiet and raw. Because I can't bear the thought of losing you, Clara. I've already lost too many people I couldn't protect. The fire popped loudly in the hearth, filling the heavy silence that followed. Frank cleared his throat and muttered something about needing a smoke before stepping outside, leaving them alone in the charged atmosphere. Clara crossed the room until she stood directly in front of Thomas. She placed her hand gently on his arm. Keeping me here won't change what happened to your wife and daughter, she said softly. And it won't keep me safe forever. Blackwood will never stop hunting me. If I don't face this with you, I'll spend the rest of my life running. She looked from his face to the silver brush on the mantel. We all have ghosts, Thomas. The only way to live with them is to face them. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of her words. He searched her face, saw the fierce determination shining there, and something inside him finally yielded. All right, he said, his voice rough with emotion, but you stay behind us, and when I give an order, you follow it, without question. Promise me that. I promise, she whispered, relief and gratitude mingling in her chest. Thomas exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he'd been carrying for years. Then God help Blackwood, he murmured, because this time he's the one being hunted. But as he turned away to plan with Frank, Clara's eyes went back to the brush. Thomas had a tell. When he lied about the brush, his left eye had twitched, just for a second, and when he'd vowed to protect her, to not lose her, that same eye had twitched again. He was hiding something, something more than just the brush. and she was about to ride into a gunfight with a man she trusted with her life, but not with the truth. The map lay open on the sheriff's desk in whispering pines like a fresh wound, its edges curled and creased from years of use. Frank Holloway, the U.S. Marshal, weighed the corners down with neat rows of cartridge rounds, while he traced the rugged terrain with a scarred forefinger. Thomas stood at his shoulder, arms folded, the same intent focus on his face that he wore when sighting down a rifle. Clara hovered nearby, memorizing every line and landmark as if she could will safety into existence. "Here," Frank said, tapping a cluster of foothills west of town. "Old mining camp. Played out 5 years ago, but the shafts are dry and there's plenty of timber for cover. It's Blackwood's kind of place." Thomas nodded. "Two approaches. Main trail from the east is the obvious one. That's the route he'll be watching." Clara leaned closer, her shadow falling across the map. "There's a narrow path behind the ridge," she offered, her own finger tracing a faint line from a notch in the hills to the camp. "The stagecoach used it just before they were attacked. It runs tight between the rock spines. A small party could move through without being seen." Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You read this country well, Miss Clara." "Because it tried to kill me," she answered softly. "You learn fast when your life depends on it." Thomas glanced at her, a mixture of pride and worry tangled in his eyes. He turned back to Frank. "You and Isaiah take the main trail, make some noise, draw their fire. Cooper and Mitch can swing around using the path Clara marked. Cut off their escape route. When they're set, you give the signal, and we squeeze the trap shut." "We?" Frank echoed, a small smile playing on his lips. Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm not sitting this one out, Frank." "Didn't figure you would," the marshal said. They finalized the plan with the quick, practiced economy of men who knew the deadly business of ambushes. Frank and his deputy Isaiah would create a diversion from the east. The other two deputies, Cooper and Mitch, would take the high ground to the west. Thomas would hold a position at a rendezvous point on the northern rim, close enough to reinforce either side. And Clara was to remain in town with Deputy Atkins. Thomas rolled up the map and holstered it in his coat, like a promise. The room fell quiet, the kind of heavy silence that gathers in the air just before a thunderstorm. He turned to Clara. "We move at first light. You'll stay here." Her mouth opened to argue, then closed. She knew it was a losing battle. He'd given an order, and she'd given her word. So she nodded, her expression grim. "Come back," she said, her voice steady. "All of you." "We will," Frank promised, tipping his hat. Outside, a low mist drifted along Main Street, clinging to the wooden storefronts like a ghost. Thomas walked Clara to the porch of the small hotel. The golden wash of a lantern put soft halos at the edges of his stubble and shadowed the deep worry carved into his brow. They stood a step apart, the small distance packed with all the unsaid things that had gathered between them in stitched wounds and whispered stories. "Tomorrow will be hard," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of stones. "I know," she replied. "So is breathing with a bullet in your leg. We survived that. We can survive this." Something in his posture eased just a touch, like a taut cinch loosening one notch. He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, the callus on his thumb a slow, careful drag against her skin. "Clara," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up. In his eyes she saw the man who had carried her through the darkness, and the man who had lost a wife and a daughter in a different, deeper dark. And both gazes were focused, fierce, and achingly kind. "If I come back—" He stopped, swallowed, and started again. "When I come back, I'll ask you proper. I'll ask you to make that cabin your home, to make me your home." Her breath caught in her throat. The world shrank to the small space between them, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "Then come back," she whispered. "Ask." He dipped his head and kissed her. It wasn't a grand, sweeping claim, nor a desperate clutch in the shadow of impending violence. It was a question, asked with his mouth and answered with hers, soft, certain, and tasting of hope. When he broke away, he rested his forehead against hers. "Sleep," he said, though he didn't sound convinced either of them would. "Dawn comes fast." It did, cold and silver, with frost bright on the grass. The town was moving, but quietly, as if not to disturb the day's fragile fate. Frank and his deputies were already mounted outside the office, silhouettes in the lifting mist. Thomas checked his Winchester, spun the cylinder on his Colt, and then slid a small derringer from an inner pocket. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed it into Clara's hand. "Keep it," he told her. "Close range only. It's a last resort." She closed her fingers around the little gun, its weight far heavier than its size. "Come back," she said again, a prayer this time. He swung into his saddle, touched the brim of his hat, and rode out with the others. The hoofbeats faded to a muted thunder on the packed earth. Clara stood in the middle of the street until they had vanished completely into the pale, lifting fog. Then she turned, her jaw set. She dressed in the trousers Thomas had found for her, pulled on his spare wool coat, and slid the derringer into her pocket. At the livery she found an old mare who looked as if she'd seen worse and kept going anyway. Deputy Atkins sputtered with protest when she led the horse past the sheriff's office, but she moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made her decision. Miss Clara, the sheriff said—" "I know what he said," she answered, her voice as calm as the inside of a chapel. "He told me to stay behind him, and that's exactly where I'll be." Then she nudged the mare into the pale morning light and followed the tracks of the men who were riding toward a fight she had started. She had given her word, but some promises were made to be broken, especially when the life of the man you were beginning to love was on the line. She still didn't trust him completely, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let him die, not without knowing the truth. The foothills lifted out of the prairie like the spine of some great, sleeping beast, the land pulling itself into sharp ridges and deep folds. The ride was long enough for fear to argue with resolve and lose. Clara reached the rendezvous point just as the last of the morning mist burned away under the rising sun. From her vantage point she could see it all, the faint thread of the main trail to the east, the knife-edge pass to the west, and the dirty smudge of smoke rising from the mining camp nestled in the valley below. Thomas was waiting in a line of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed, the reins of his horse held loose in his hand. When she appeared he sighed, a sound of equal parts gratitude and resignation. "I told you to stay in town," he said, his voice flat, without heat. "You told me to stay behind you," she returned, lifting her chin. "And I will." He studied her for a long, silent beat. Then the corner of his mouth tugged upwards in a ghost of a smile. "Then stay," he said simply, and offered her his hand. She took it, letting the steadiness of his grip run all the way up her arm, chasing away the last of her trembling. "Last chance to change your mind," he added. "I'm with you," she said, her voice clear and strong. "All the way to the end." A bird call, high and sharp, whistled 3 short notes from the ridge to the west. It was Frank's signal. Everyone was in position. The noose was drawn. Thomas tied their horses where they wouldn't be seen, and they moved low along the creek bed, climbing to a wide shelf of rock that gave them a clean, unobstructed view of the camp. A handful of weather-beaten buildings crouched around the black mouth of the main mine shaft. Smoke rose from the chimney of what must have been the foreman's cabin. 3 horses stood in a rough corral, their tails swishing lazily at flies. There were no men visible, but the place hummed with a menace that filled the empty spaces. "Behind that boulder," Thomas murmured, pointing to a chest-high slab of basalt. "You'll see everything and still have cover." Clara slid behind the stone, the rough texture of it scraping through her coat. Thomas settled in beside her, his Winchester resting on the rock in front of him. His breathing slowed, his eyes measuring angles and distances, the way a carpenter reads the grain of a piece of wood. Across the dusty yard she could see Frank and Isaiah, ghosting from cover to cover, moving up the main trail with deliberate, practiced care. Somewhere on the far ridge, unseen, Cooper and Mitch were waiting like patient wolves. Frank took a position behind an old, overturned ore cart and lifted his voice. "Blackwood," he called, the name cracking through the quiet of the mining camp like a thrown stone. "This is U.S. Marshal Holloway. You're surrounded. Come on out with your hands high and your weapons low." For a few heartbeats there was only silence. Then a bullet spat dust from the dirt, just inches from Frank's boot. A coarse, horse-like laugh rolled out of the cabin. "Come on and get us, Marshal," a voice barked. "We got food, water, and more bullets than you brought bodies." "Stubborn," Thomas muttered under his breath. "Cornered," Clara breathed. Another shot cracked, this time from the west ridge. Cooper or Mitch announcing their presence, closing the trap. The cabin door inched open, and a white scrap of cloth waved uncertainly in the smoky air. Clara felt the first flicker of hope flare in her chest. Maybe this could end without more bloodshed. Then all hell broke loose. The cabin's back door burst open, and two of Blackwood's men sprinted for the corral, rifles firing wildly to provide cover. A third man, tall and dressed in a black duster, stepped onto the porch and began laying down a hard, steady curtain of covering fire. It was him, Blackwood. Gunfire detonated from 3 directions at once. A thunderclap stretched out and jagged. Frank and Isaiah replied in disciplined bursts. Shots from the west bit chunks out of the yard, forcing the two runners to zig and zag. Thomas sighted down his Winchester, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. One of the sprinting men stumbled, a round catching him in the thigh. He went down, but kept dragging himself toward the horses with a stubborn, flailing grit. Clara knelt lower behind the boulder as rounds whined past, hot bees in the air. Through a gap in the rocks, she saw the wounded man's bandana, a dirty red she remembered from her fever dreams. It was the one who had shot her when she ran. Her fingers instinctively closed around the derringer in her pocket, a small, cold talisman. But then movement to her left snagged her attention. It was Blackwood. He had slipped from the cabin's shadow and was climbing the ridge, moving at a low, predatory angle, his eyes fixed on the very shelf of rock where she and Thomas lay concealed. Thomas, his attention focused on the chaos in the yard below, hadn't seen him yet. "Thomas," she hissed, her voice urgent, "to your left." Thomas pivoted, his rifle swinging around, but Blackwood was faster. The outlaw's pistol flashed, and the bullet hit Thomas high in the shoulder. The impact spun him back against the rock with a sickening thud. He grunted, the sound thick and torn, and dropped to one knee, his own return shot going wide. Blackwood grinned, his teeth wolf-white in his sunburned face. He advanced slowly, the barrel of his gun leveled at Thomas's chest. It was execution distance, the kind of range a man took to end a story on his own terms. Clara didn't think. She surged to her feet, the rough boulder scraping her hip. She drew the small derringer and stepped out from behind the cover, closing the space between them until the little gun's meager power meant something. Her voice, when it came, was shockingly steady. "Drop it," she said. Blackwood's eyes flicked to her, surprise sparking in them, quickly followed by a cruel delight. "Well, well," he drawled, "the little rabbit has teeth." He kept his pistol trained on Thomas. "That toy won't stop me before I kill him." "It will," Clara said. her voice dropping to an icy calm. "If I put the bullet through your eye, and at this distance I won't miss." Doubt crawled across his face. For a moment they stood frozen in a tight circle of breath and gunmetal, the thunder of the larger fight rolling and echoing below them like weather on the next range over. A horse screamed from the corral and tore free, bolting into the hills. For a fraction of a second, Blackwood glanced toward the sound, one single heartbeat of divided attention. It was all Thomas needed. Despite the blood slicking down his sleeve, he drove forward, his good shoulder crunching hard into Blackwood's legs. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the outlaw's pistol firing harmlessly into the sky before skittering across the rock. Clara lunged and scooped up the fallen gun, its heavy weight feeling solid and real in her hand. She swung it back toward the knot of struggling bodies, trying to find a clear shot that didn't include Thomas's heart. "Hold on." Frank's voice floated up from the yard, breathless with exertion. "We're coming." Blackwood snarled and fought dirty, digging a wicked-looking knife from his boot and slashing in close, vicious arcs. The blade caught Thomas across the forearm. He sucked in a sharp breath but didn't let go. They rolled and scraped, their boots gouging dust from the stone as they slid closer and closer to the shelf's lip. "Let him go, Thomas," Clara called, circling for an angle. "I have him." Thomas didn't answer. He was beyond words now, in that place where pain and will fuse together, and a man becomes a single burning intent. "Shoot him," he gasped once, a fleck of blood touching his lips. "Now." But before she could line up a shot, they rolled again, and the world tilted. The two men toppled over the edge in a tangle of flailing limbs, vanishing from her sight. Clara's heart obeyed gravity and fell right after them. She scrambled to the rim, her breath catching in her throat as she peered down the 15-foot slope of fractured rock and scrub brush. Blackwood and Thomas lay in a heap against a large boulder at the bottom. Neither of them was moving. She didn't hesitate. She slid down the slope, half running, half falling, skinning her palms and knees on the sharp rocks. She reached them in a cloud of dust, her pistol clattering to the ground beside her. "Thomas," she breathed, turning him carefully. His face was ashen under the grime and blood. His shirt was soaked dark at the shoulder, with another slick red line running down his forearm. She pressed her trembling fingers to his throat, feeling for a pulse. She found nothing at first, then deeper. There it was, a stubborn, thready thud like a fist knocking from a long way away. "He's alive," she called, her head snapping up as Frank and Isaiah appeared at the ridgetop. "He's alive, but he's bleeding bad." "Hold on," Frank yelled, his voice clipped and urgent. "We're coming down." He spared one quick look at Blackwood's body, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and didn't bother checking for a pulse. "That one's done." Clara pressed her hands to Thomas's shoulder, trying to become a bandage, a tourniquet, a prayer. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "You promised to come back. I promised to answer." His eyelids fluttered for a moment. She saw a flash of blue, cloudy with pain, but present. "Told you. To stay behind the rock," he muttered. And somehow she laughed, a small, wet, broken sound that shook apart inside her. "Not when you were the one who needed saving," she said. The corners of his mouth twitched, the ghost of his porch-light smile, before his consciousness slid away again, leaving her alone with his bleeding body and the dead man who had started it all. Frank and Isaiah scrambled down the slope, the marshal moving with the speed of a man who had done this grim dance too many times. "We need to get him leveled out," Frank said, his eyes assessing the wounds with a practiced glance. "Isaiah, rig a travois. Mitch," he shouted up toward the western ridge, "bring the horses." From somewhere above, Cooper's answering whistle cut through the air, followed by the distant clatter of hooves on rock. They bound Thomas's wounds as best they could, using cloth torn from their own shirts, applying pressure that was tight and unrelenting. Isaiah's big, calloused hands were shockingly gentle. Clara never let go of Thomas's fingers, not even to wipe the blood from her own wrists. When they hauled him up the steep slope with ropes and curse-bitten encouragements, she climbed alongside, her legs shaking so hard it felt like a drumbeat against the rock. The ride back to Whispering Pines was a desperate race against the clock the body keeps, each minute a victory, each mile a prayer. They lashed Thomas to the makeshift travois, and Clara rode beside him, counting his shallow breaths the way she'd once counted steps to a schoolhouse in Boston. By the time the doors of the town clinic banged open, Thomas's skin had turned hot and dry to the touch, his pulse a rabbit's frantic dash and stumble. Dr. Bennett, a man with a tired face and sleeves already rolled up, took one look and started barking orders. "Bullet in the shoulder, looks deep," Frank reported. "Knife wound across the forearm. Fell about 15 feet. He's lost a lot of blood." "Get out, unless you're useful," the doctor snapped. Then his eyes fell on Clara, who had planted herself firmly at the basin, already starting to wash the blood from her hands. "You useful, miss?" "My father was a physician," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I can follow orders." "Then boil water," he commanded, "and don't you dare faint." The hours that followed were a blur measured in stitches and steam, in the sharp, clean sting of carbolic acid and the slow, tight pull of thread through flesh. They were measured in the way Thomas's breath hitched and rattled whenever the fever grabbed hold of him, and the way Clara's low, steady voice seemed to smooth him back down. She told him stories of mint leaves growing by a fence and summer porches back east, of the precise way his smile started at one corner of his mouth and worked its way slowly across. Near dawn, his eyes opened for real. For a breath, he was lost in the fog of pain. Then he found her, his gaze locking onto her face as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Where else would I be?" she whispered, a tear she didn't know she was holding, finally tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "You told me to stay behind you. I'm just keeping up." He tried to smile and winced. "Hurts like hell," he said. "That's why I'm here," she answered, echoing his first vow to her, and the smallest measure of peace rolled through the tight lines of his face, as if her words had both weight and warmth. Frank stepped in later, after the doctor had declared the worst was over for now. He held a small dented locket in his palm. "We found this in Blackwood's saddlebags," he said quietly. Clara took it from him, her fingers numb. She fumbled with the clasp and opened it. Inside was a faded miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a small girl with a serious face. Thomas's wife and daughter. Blackwood was the man who had destroyed Thomas's life 8 years ago. Justice had been done. But as Clara looked from the locket to Thomas's sleeping face, a new cold fear began to settle in her heart. She hadn't just helped a lawman catch a killer. She had helped a man find his revenge. And she had no idea what that kind of closure would do to him, or what would be left when the hunt was finally, truly over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales of justice from the wild frontier.